Hey everyone! Today we're taking what can honestly feel like an absolute maze of federal workplace health rules, and we're going to translate them into a clear, actionable safety playbook. If you manage a team or oversee a facility, navigating these regulations can sometimes feel like trying to read a foreign language. But don't worry, we're going to break it all down so you know exactly what's expected of you, why it actually matters, and most importantly, how to keep your people safe. Now, before we really get into the weeds, I want you to ask yourself a pretty tough question. Is your current operation genuinely prepared to handle invisible hazards? We aren't talking about a slippery floor or a heavy falling object here. We're talking about microscopic materials floating in the air or just resting silently on a workstation. How do you defend against a threat that flies completely under the radar of our basic human senses? To get your facility up to speed, we're going to break this down into 6 logical steps. We'll start by defining these hidden hazards, talk about building your daily safety playbook, and then finish up with what happens if you ignore these rules. All right, step 1, the hidden workplace hazard. We really need to nail down exactly what kind of microscopic threats we're talking about here, and why it is your absolute non-negotiable duty as an employer to manage them. Federal authorities define these hazards really broadly. Basically, we're looking at any substance or even a mixture that's linked to dangerous tissue growth over time. If the science shows a material can trigger these issues or even just speed them up, it gets flagged. And the intent here is highly preventative. Regulators want to make sure that any material with the capacity to cause long-term, severe cellular changes is strictly monitored way before anyone actually gets sick. Moving on to step 2, understanding hazard threat levels. Look, let's be practical for a second. Not every single hazardous material needs a massive code-red emergency response, right? So regulators basically divide these threats into 2 main camps. First, you've got your confirmed high-risk materials. These have hard scientific proof backing them up from human or robust animal studies. The rule here, strict physical controls. And if a safer substitute exists, exposure has to drop to absolute 0. Then, on the other hand, you have suspected risk. The evidence is suggestive, but a bit less conclusive, so it demands extreme care, ongoing monitoring, and strict case-by-case exposure limits. Organizing it this way helps you immediately grasp the severity and the urgency of the protective measures you need to roll out. Okay, part 3, creating your safety playbook. Once you know exactly what threat level you're dealing with, you definitely can't just wing it. You need a comprehensive, documented strategy to keep your team safe on the floor. Building that playbook starts with a super strict 3-step process for checking your air quality. Step 1 is initial air testing. You literally have to take scientific samples of your work environment to measure exactly how much of a hazard is airborne. Step 2 is regular tracking. This isn't a one-and-done deal. You need a routine schedule for ongoing checks. And step 3, employee notification. You cannot keep this data a secret. You have to provide your workers with written results detailing their specific exposure levels. The whole goal is making sure that you and your team always know exactly what's floating around the facility. The main takeaway here is keeping daily exposure limits safe. The rules say you have to make sure 0 workers are exposed to airborne hazards above a specific daily limit, averaged out over a standard 8-hour shift. And here's the kicker. Regulators actually prefer you to fix the environment itself. They want you re-engineering your workflows, installing better ventilation, or enclosing a process entirely, rather than just handing out masks and calling it a day. To actually hit those limits, you've got some core duties. It goes way beyond just having a written plan or physical engineering fixes. You literally have to draw lines on the floor, creating strict, restricted access zones. Inside those high-risk zones, absolutely 0 food, drinks, smoking, or even cosmetics. You're building boundaries and a strict culture of safety. Plus, you have to report your material usage and any emergencies to regional safety offices. Which brings us to step 4. What happens when those physical engineering controls just aren't cutting it to bring exposure down to a safe level? Well, when the air isn't safe, strict personal protection and hygiene protocols have to kick in. You're required to provide properly fitted respirators and protective clothing to shield the skin and eyes. And this is crucial. You must provide this gear at absolutely no cost to your team. You also have to supply dedicated, clean change rooms, mandatory end-of-shift showers, and climate-controlled lunchrooms with filtered air. We want to be 100% sure nobody takes microscopic dangers home with them to their families. And you know, clear communication is an absolute must. Your workspaces and any waste disposal containers, they need stark, unmissable, highly visible signs. These signs need to clearly warn of the specific health risks, like cancer hazards, and explicitly restrict entry to authorized personnel only. If the air quality requires a respirator, the sign has to loudly state that too. Nobody should ever wander into a hazardous zone by accident. All right, on to step 5, tracking health and exposure. This is huge because these specific health risks, they can take years, sometimes literally decades to actually show up, which means your responsibility extends way beyond the day-to-day shift. So, as an employer, you're required to sponsor health tracking for your staff. That means offering free, initial, and ongoing medical exams. But you don't just send them to a doctor blindly. You have to give the examining doctors exact data on the employee's exposure and their safety gear. And importantly, there are strict privacy rules here. The doctor's report back to you has to focus strictly on job-related risks, which protects your employee's general medical privacy. And get this, 30-plus years. You actually have to securely archive these medical checkups and air monitoring documents for the entire time a worker is employed with you, plus decades after they leave. Because cellular changes have such a long latency period, this paper trail has to be preserved just in case health issues surface much later in someone's life. But keeping records is really only half the equation, right? You also have to empower your team through training. This means educating them the minute they're assigned a task, and periodically after that. You've got to detail the exact location and nature of the hazards in your building. You must teach them the proper use and, critically, the limitations of their safety gear. And, of course, you've got to run through emergency spill, alarm, and evacuation procedures so everyone knows exactly what to do if things go wrong. Finally, step 6. What's the actual price of ignoring all these rules? Well, aside from risking lives, which is obviously bad enough, skipping these protocols triggers some massive and immediate regulatory crackdowns. If you ignore routine safety and a severe threat pops up, the authorities are not going to wait around. They'll issue what's called an emergency temporary standard. This means immediate federal intervention, totally bypassing standard bureaucratic timelines. You'll be hit with mandatory immediate gear deployment, meaning you have to instantly force the use of respirators and protective suits, regardless of the disruption or the cost to your business. On top of that, you'll be forced to install specialized alarms and immediate evacuation protocols for any accidental releases. It is a heavy-handed, incredibly costly intervention on your daily operations, and it happens fast. So I want you to take a really hard look at your compliance playbook today. Review your air monitoring, your engineering controls, your medical tracking. Are your current safety standards actually equipped to handle hazards you can't even see? Because when it comes to the long-term health of your team, there is absolutely no room for cutting corners. Thanks for joining me on this, and stay safe out there.
If you found this helpful or want to stay updated when this regulation changes, subscribe and support the channel. And if you need the full technical details on this CFR, click the link in the description below. See you next time.